Yeah, my book fell on the floor as you
Oh
were talking.
no, get it
Yeah,
back.
well,
I have it here. Hi everyone, welcome to Poetology. In this video, I interview Kostya Tsolakis and we talk about queer poetry, the coming of age narrative, and writing in English as a second language. Kostya also reads a poem from his pamphlet Ephebos. So go get yourself a cup of tea and I'll see you on the other side. Thank you so much for agreeing to do an interview with me for Poetology. I'm really happy to have you today.
it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I was thinking about what brought us together, like Queer Studio, and the fact that there seem to be more events recently about queer poetry and more publications such as 14 Poems and Queerlings. What do you think LGBTQ plus poets bring to the contemporary poetry scene?
I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently. And in order to answer this question, I thought I had to go back to my own experience as a reader. Um, I used to read mostly fiction when I was a teenager and then in my 20s. So it took me a while to get to a point where I was reading more poetry than I was reading anything else. But I just remember growing up and also when I was in my 20s and I wasn't out to many people, slowly coming out. I was quite amazed by how so many of the novels I was reading from the 19th century, the 20th century, lacked queer characters. Um, so there was this absence on the page that kind of made me feel very difficult to. I found it very difficult sometimes to see myself in many of the characters I was reading. So I think the answer when it comes to poetry is that, especially in the past 5, 10 years, um, finally, queer poets are putting themselves on the stage and the page in a much more, in a very confident way and in a very present way. And I think it's been a case of us inspiring each other, actually, uh, slowly. Um, Andrew McMillan wrote an article in Poetry Wales saying that maybe if you looked on the poetry shelves in bookshops 10 years ago, it might be very difficult to find queer poetry easily. Maybe you had to search a bit harder. Um, of course, there was Thom Gunn, a few decades ago. But I think there has been this burst, this boom of queer poetry in the past 5 years. And maybe there's an element of confidence among us as well. Maybe social media is helping with visibility and also with people connecting with each other. So I think that has been, social media I think have had a very sort of positive, there have been a positive influence in that. Because you mentioned 14 poems. I sort of I found out about 14 poems when, I don't know, it was June last year, and I had a few poems I wanted to send out to a few magazines, and I said, are there any new places, any place open, especially welcoming for queer poetry? And 14 poems, so Ben, I discovered later, was the editor, said, hi, hi, we're here, we're new, can you send us a few poems? And this is how I discovered them. And I think also through social media, maybe we're sort of discovering magazines in places further afield that we can order. And also the fact that people from around the world who are submitting to these magazines is phenomenal. It's such an amazing thing to see happening. So we get to know each other. But at the same time, I think apart from that, of course, I guess we just want to make ourselves present. We want to have our voice heard. you know, I can give you my own personal reasons why I'm writing poetry, but I think many people will also feel the same. When I think about it, for me, it's a way of standing my ground, of confronting the voices in my head that in the past said I should not speak, I should not voice myself, I should not say what I felt. Or it's a great way for us to question, assess, or sing about the things we care for or we believe is very important to confront or talk about, and also share our experiences that in many cases have been closeted ones, you know. It has surprised me that I'm writing a lot about my teenage years, my closeted years, but maybe that's because 25 years ago, I wasn't able to say what I wanted, express how I feel, be it on the page or to anybody. And suddenly I feel like I'm giving a voice to that 16, 17-year-old boy, finally, after all these years. So I think that's a reason. Another great thing, though, I think it's relatively straightforward for people to maybe start a platform online in order to kind of offer a home and a space for these voices. You know, sometimes all you need is a Wix account and so maybe a friend who knows how to do things design-wise. And you know, the investment is not huge, maybe online, and also it's much more accessible as a result. Depending what you want. I really like the fact that I can order 14 poems and read it in my hands, you know, hold it in my hands and read it. It's a beautiful thing. It's also fantastic that we see established magazines having a queer focus. I don't know whether many people are aware of that issue, but about 2 years ago, or is it even 3, Modern Poetry and Translation had a LGBTQ focus, and it was amazing. I think it's an incredible issue that came out with lots of poetry and translation. I translated something for it as well. But I also love the editorial that Clare Pollard, who is the editor of the magazine at the moment, wrote. It inspired me because she said very often translation itself is a form of drag, because you might have a man translating a woman, for example. And I did that at some point with the poem translating things that my mother wrote to me in an email. So the incredible thing, the amazing thing is that we have all these public spaces where we can exchange our thoughts among ourselves, with the poetry community about what we're trying to achieve. I mean, there's not just a single goal that everybody's trying to achieve. We all have our personal reasons why we, as queer poets, are writing. But I think the brilliant thing is that we have a community that we can exchange ideas with, hang out with virtually at the moment, unfortunately, but it's just a great sort of feeling of community and compassion and friendliness and support. I think that's incredibly important. And I just love discovering new voices through all these publications that you mentioned earlier, for example, and all the online events. I think it's a great time. It's a fantastic moment in time to be writing as a queer poet, as a queer writer, generally, I think.
Yeah, and so much of it is about reclaiming our own perspectives that are usually dismissed or discarded or marginalized in some way. I think it's a very powerful thing to be able to exchange that with each other and encourage ourselves and each other along the way.
Absolutely.
And one thing we also have in common is that we've grown up with a queer experience in another country and then moved to the UK. You've been here for way longer than I have, but you can maybe talk about that. Do you think there's also, because it's such a typical kind of queer narrative sometimes, you know, you come of age and go somewhere else and you know, and I was wondering if you find yourself writing about that, and also maybe questioning some of those like cliches in some way.
Yeah. I mean, it took me a very long time to start writing poetry more seriously, if you want. Because up until I was about 34, I was heavily more into I was trying to write a novel, coming of age novel. But I don't know, fiction just didn't really work for me. And I think fiction really needs it needs a focus and a dedication that maybe having a 9 to 5, 9 to 6 job doesn't really allow you. Whereas with poetry, I found it much more, it was, I'm not going to say easy, because it's not easy writing a poem. It's really, really difficult. But I could fit it into my life a little bit more. And then I also discovered that it also suits my voice a lot more. And I wanted to write about personal things without really it being fiction. What did surprise me was the fact that I ended up writing a lot about being a teenager and that coming of age moment, as you say. Maybe because that's the period of my life where, as I said earlier, I didn't feel I could open up about things. But also it's a moment in time that I want to question and challenge a little bit more. Because I grew up in Athens. So it's a more liberal place. It's a bit more cosmopolitan. It's a bit more open-minded in some respects, but that doesn't mean that I still didn't grow up within a very sort of macho, traditional, conservative environment. So in many respects, I was able to kind of see what was going out in the world. I had access to that. I knew I wanted to come to England because I was pretty confident I had a bigger chance to be happy on my own terms as a gay lad at the time. But as we've moved on, some aspects of this machismo, this conservative kind of nationalistic mindset is still there in Greece. So for me, writing poetry offers me a chance to challenge that, to look into history as well, and question the established narrative that is being fed to us in school. A very binary narrative, Greeks good, Turks bad. Greeks, again, good and brave, foreigners, meddling, bad influence, that kind of narrative. But it's a much more complex situation in history, in Greek history. So I just would like to investigate those aspects and kind of even discover for myself that things I was told in school do not actually stand, or things we make ourselves believe as a nation do not actually stand, right? Or are exaggerated, or have been kind of gilded in a way that presents historical event in a much more glorious way, as opposed to the brutal reality of it. It's always interesting to read the history of what the Greeks did during wartime. I think there's a tendency to present the Greeks always as the victims, as never as an invader, what have you. And you can't, it's a taboo almost to kind of try and question these things, appalling behavior that happened in wartime from a Greek side as well. It's still very taboo, Some people will talk about it, but then they might be called traitors, what have you. The problem is I don't live in Greece anymore, so I can't fully take part in the debate that maybe is happening on the ground, but I do read the press all the time. I do go on Twitter, and there's still this very strong side of wanting to hold on to these ideals and these narratives. So yeah, through by writing about my coming of age, I think I sort of simultaneously kind of question the environment I grew up in, because I'm part of it. My character is a result of my upbringing. Where the crisis happened is when I realized, firstly, that I didn't really fit fully this narrative as a queer person, as somebody who's also got, partly German ancestry. That complicates things in my family history. So I just like sort of tackling these topics that may be a bit uncomfortable for people to discuss because they sort of challenge the ideal. But at the same time, I think offers a much more human side to history, to society, to, instill a little bit of compassion into this narrative, make it more human, I think, as opposed to something we put on a pedestal. I don't know if I'm making sense, am I?
You are making sense. Yes, thank you. It's interesting how writing about our past also challenges the environment that we were in. I think that's true. Whenever I find myself writing about earlier experience, it's not usually in a good light either, maybe. But yeah, it often tries to grapple with all these things that were not visible when I was a child, but that actually shaped my experience and were very limiting or very difficult to deal with because I did not see myself mirrored in the world.
Yeah, I think very often we carry, we realize that the way we felt in the past at a certain time, because society or the people around us kind of made us feel a certain way. For example, shame, when I was a teenager, I felt really ashamed of how I felt. Even though I knew that was it, I didn't really sort of question my sexuality. I was pretty sort of sure that I liked boys when I was 12, 13, and that carried on. But I knew that that society and my family had a problem with that. And that bothered me, and it made me very angry for a very long time. And it took me a long time to shake that anger off. That happened the moment I came out to my parents, and all that pressure just went out of me.
Wow.
And I became a much calmer person. So honestly, I was so angry up until I was about 30, really angry. That depressed me, that made me very anxious. I'm so glad I came out, because otherwise I think it would have eaten me up. And I think that's the feeling I try to write about, that awful feeling I felt. I want to put it on the page and say, this wasn't right. I think it's a way of me reconciling with the person I was and giving him a bit of a break. And allowing him to kind of breathe in these pages. I felt incredibly angry.
That's beautiful, though. I love the way you've just worded that, giving that boy some space to breathe on the page.
On the page, yeah, it's a big space. The page, if you want to, if you want to offer that space, I think.
And one more thing I'd like us to discuss is, well, you've worked a lot with translation. You've been a translator yourself, and you were also founding co-editor of Harana Poetry for writers who write in English as a second or parallel language. And so I thought you might have something to share about what it means to write in a language that is not necessarily your first language, and that sort of community that you have created around that.
That's always an interesting thing for me to think about. to begin with, a few years ago, I realized that perhaps the reason why I'm not writing in Greek is because for me, Greek is my language of the closet. Whereas I came to England and, this is a place where I felt freer. English was a language of my first exchanges with partners and sex and, chat rooms back in the day. And slowly it actually became the language I felt more comfortable in. I don't really have that many people I speak Greek to on an everyday basis. Also, because Greece and Greek was a language of hurt for me, I did turn my back to Greece and reading stuff in Greek for a very long time. A very long time. So I would say even about 10 years. There was a period in my early 30s when I didn't go back to Greece for about 2 years, something like that. I think that's because I was still processing. I think when I came out to my parents, we were still kind of processing it. They were processing it. I didn't really want to be around them for a bit. So that was, and that's I think what got me, that's why I moved away from Greek, I think, as a working language, as a language I write in. I mean, I try to write emails sometimes in Greek and I really struggle. Whereas with emails in English, it just comes out much more easily.
Yeah.
I think English also offered me a safe space where I could express myself. And also because most of the queer poets I read write in English or have been translated into English. So that's my influence there. I'm not going to say that writing in English as a second language hasn't got its difficulties. However long I've lived here, 22 years this year, it's still, I talk to my partner sometimes and he comes up with some expressions or says a few things that do not come naturally to me. They're sort of English expressions that are within easy reach, whereas I always think of English as a sort of pouch that's not very deep. It's still a hefty pouch where you can pick words and expressions from, but it's not as deep as the one that somebody who grew up speaking English has. But that's also kind of a good challenge. You kind of discover English as you go sometimes when you write in English as a second language. I love looking into etymology, and sort of seeing what these words kind of meant 300, 400 years ago. Can you sort of adapt it in a way that it can mean both things, I love the word queer, for example. It's being used in Greek as well, and I think it has been as liberating and in a safe space for me to write in a language that my mother tongue. So Greek is not really a language where I have encountered people writing about the things that concern me at the moment. There's very few examples. Andreas Angelakis is a poet I always talk about, a Greek gay poet writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s. He died in 1991 of AIDS, and you can't really find his books anywhere. You have to kind of go to secondhand bookshops to find his poetry. But it's the only, apart from Cavafy, with whom I relate, because he writes about same-sex desire and hedonism and compassion, and and he also questions history. But he is a Greek Alexandrian from about 100 plus years ago. So he is a bit of I call him my uncle, Kostis, in a way. Whereas Andreas Angelakis, he wrote in a time when I was alive, and he writes about things I can relate very closely, but he's the only voice in Greek that I have, that I'm aware of, that I can sort of relate to. Whereas in English, I feel I'm part of a much bigger sort of community writing at the moment. Now, when it comes to Harana, when I started submitting to magazines, there was not really, I couldn't really see a place where that was asking maybe specifically poetry from people like me, like us. Which kind of, because in the beginning I was feeling a little bit nervous about sending things out. I thought that maybe because I'm writing in English as a second language, my poetry is not as good. But so I just sort of thought, maybe, you know, if I can't find a space, why not create one? And the more I was reading, the more people I was discovering who write in English as a second language, like you, for example. And eventually I also discovered that, you know, Brooks University runs a competition that has 2 equal categories, with one of them being for ESL poets. So I discovered there's so many of us out there, and really talented. And so then I met Romalyn Ante, who's my co-editor, because I realized I didn't really think I could do it on my own. I wanted to bring in somebody else's mindset, taste into the picture as well, so that maybe I could, you know, the great thing is very often we coincide on which poems we like that we get sent to us. But then sometimes, you know, we go out there and we sort of maybe solicit poems from different people that we know, people that I know, and then Roma will bring other people that she knows as well. So we add more voices into the mix. And I couldn't do it without her. And the great thing is, the day I told her that, oh, would you be interested in, you know, editing this magazine with me? She just immediately said yes. And also she kind of got it going as well. I could have easily procrastinated or felt nervous about doing it, but thanks to our collaboration, we actually went for it much faster than maybe would have happened if it was just me. So I'm really grateful for that. And it's been brilliant. We got so much positive, so many positive responses when we announced the project. But we also wanted it to be a little bit of an, you know, more broad church when it came to who we invited to submit poems. So, you know, the parallel language bit is, you know, so can be interpreted in many different ways. You know, somebody who maybe can write a poem in a very sort of innovative way, or, you know, from our queer studio, if you remember, Paul Stephenson, he sent a poem using Spanish from the time when he lived in Madrid. And for him, it was such a liberating experience to be in Spain, going out to the clubs. He felt, you know, very free, and he associates Spanish with that freedom in the same way that I associate English with that freedom, right? So it's great to be receiving submissions from people who also interpret parallel language in whichever way they want. It could be like a very vague memory of a grandparent speaking another language, you know, and it's nice to bring that in. Because what is poetry after all? You know, it's about memory, you know. Cavafy, you know, always talks about memory. And memory is the tricky thing in poetry, isn't it? Because you might put something down and you need to allow the possibility that it might not be exactly as it happened, but this is how your memory remembers it.
Could you read us a poem?
I was trying to think which one to read. I was trying to think maybe I should read one that I haven't really read that much. Yeah, so I'm going to read one that maybe the reason why I want to read it is because even though the pamphlet is it's got both my mum and dad's in it, in the first collection I'm working on at the moment, I think it's going to be a little bit more kind of leaning towards my mother at its heart. I want my second collection eventually to be more about my father. But this is why I think I want to sort of read one that is more about my dad. So it's quite an old poem. I think I sort of started writing it about 4 years ago this week, because I remember being in Greece 4 years ago this week, and this is where it came from. So, in the kitchen with Dad. For dinner, Dad has paximadia, the spicy green peppers he likes grilled, a portion of cheese and a glass of red. Mom now buys his wine from Lidl. It's cheap, but very good, Dad says. Are you happy in England? He asks. Feigning satisfaction with my usual answer, he goes on telling me stories of Pat Pattle, the RAF pilot he's reading about. The Nazis shot him to pieces aged 26. The Greeks have forgotten him, Dad says. Another glass, and Dad recites Homer in classical Greek, which I don't understand. Then hums a German drinking song his mother sang to him before the war. By his third glass, Dad's plate is empty. The untimely dead of his life have gathered round the table. Wiping his eyes, Dad says, "Be patient with your mother. I deal with her all day."
Thank you, that's great. Yes.
It's interesting reading a poem, because especially after you've done an interview, because it kind of makes me realize why I enjoy writing poetry, because it kind of offers me the chance to kind of put my words down on the page in a less scatterbrained way. But I kind of also enjoy the opportunity of also having a much more gathered way, a much more, I don't want to use the word controlled, but a much more, sort of a neater way of expressing myself. So I find that very interesting, this contrast between reading a poem and also talking to somebody. And both sides are fine, but I like the fact I also get the chance to to read a poem and people compose.
That's something so satisfying about it. For me, it's the order of it, and also the ritualistic element of having it in a particular way and being able to read it again and again and kind of go through the ritual. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I've included many of the links that we mentioned in the description below. Make sure you go get your own copy of Kostya's Ephebos, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye.